Voilà. Qu'est-ce que c'est que ça? Connectez-vous pour un...
Bon, ça y est, ça enregistre.
C'est quoi ce... Je sais pas. Voilà. Donc, nous l'invitons car il a publié récemment Trouble with Gender, Sex, Facts, Gender Fiction, qui est donc qui a été publié au Royaume-Uni chez Politis Press. Alors, Polity Press. Alors, juste un petit mot sur la publication de ce livre je suis désolée, j'accueille en même temps les gens. Donc il devait publier en fait ce livre. Il a eu un contrat avec les presses d'Oxford, University Press. Et c'était donc soutenu par cette maison d'édition en 2021. Et en fait, la situation a changé après une controverse liée à la publication de son ouvrage. Donc effectivement, il y a eu des pressions et donc Oxford University Press a annulé la participation de Byrne à, avant ce livre, en fait, un chapitre sur les pronoms dans un ouvrage collectif. Donc en fait, il a soumis son manuscrit dans un second temps, donc son essai donc Trouble with Gender à cet éditeur. Et dans un courriel, l'éditeur a justifié sa décision de renoncer parce que il considérait que il ne traitait pas le sujet de manière suffisamment sérieuse et respectueuse. Donc on n'a même pas, Alex Byrne n'a pas pu remanier même son manuscrit et il a tout simplement été annulé, donc là, enfin refusé. Et la révision a été refusée tout simplement. Et donc, c'est Politipress qui a accepté le manuscrit. Voilà. Alors, nous avons la chance aussi d'avoir Jean Szlamovicz, qui est donc professeur de linguistique et traducteur, linguiste, professeur à l'université de Bourgogne. Et Jean Szlamovicz est spécialiste de sémantique, d'analyse de discours. Il travaille sur la rhétorique et la mise en forme des idéologies. Il a publié plusieurs livres, notamment Les moutons de la pensée. C'est peut-être le plus proche le livre qui nous peut-être intéresse ici. Et évidemment, son livre sur le genre, autour des questions de genre, notamment dans la langue, l'idéologie euh, intersectionnelle, inclusiviste dans la langue et comment cette idéologie euh, a marqué la langue par notamment l'écriture inclusive. Donc il a publié un livre sur le sexe et la langue aux éditions Intervalle et il est directeur d'une collection et a publié déjà plusieurs titres, notamment Le sexe des anges cette sexe des anges hein, de François Rastier. Voilà, donc Jean Slamovitz interviendra, nous aidera peut-être à comprendre aussi le propos d'Alex Byrne. Vous pouvez activer normalement la traduction et Jean peut-être aide si Alex Byrne, tu peux effectivement lui. On va voir comment les choses, si vous avez des difficultés à comprendre, peut-être que Jean peut se faire l'interprète et Beryl aussi éventuellement. Et Jean ensuite interviendra pour poser.
J'ai prévu différentes questions
Ok,
ensuite qui permettront d'éclairer le propos et on verra au fur et à mesure comment échanger en fonction
d'accord.
des réactions des uns et des autres.
Okay, so Alex, if you want to present your...
Okay, let me try and share my screen. This is, of course, when we... Oops, sharing is not turned on.
Yes, okay. I will demande
Okay, I
d'autoriser.
just
Okay,
sent you a request.
it's okay.
Multiple presenters can share. Okay, let's see. Okay, oh my God. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I mean, one of the many problems with the COVID pandemic is that now these Zoom presentations have become standard And I would have much preferred to actually be in Paris rather than present from Boston, but I'll take this. It's certainly better than nothing. So Celine mentioned my troubles with publishing Trouble with Gender with Oxford University Press. It was eventually published, as you said, by Polity Press. If anyone wants to encourage some French publishing house to arrange a French translation, that would be great. Somewhat strangely, it's the first translation that was picked up was from Korea. So the Korean translation is coming out very soon. And I apologize for not giving this talk in French. I actually grew up in the UK across the Channel, and so I was subject to many years of compulsory French instruction, almost none of which stuck. So my French is embarrassingly bad, even after all those years. Okay, so I thought I would talk just about some themes that the book engages with, and try and relate those to things that are going on right now, in particular in the US and in my profession of philosophy. So let me start with, how do I advance these slides? Okay, here we are. Yeah, so let me start with a few recent examples from the New York Times, United States' most influential newspaper. So Jack Turban is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who works at the University of California, San Francisco, and he is one of the public faces of gender-affirming care in the US today, and he had this opinion piece in the Times in July. I'm a psychiatrist. Here's how I talk to transgender youth and their families about gender identity. And this was really a promotional piece for his recent book, which I reviewed incidentally. You can find the review on my website, Free to Be: Understanding Kids and Gender Identity. And he starts off saying, the most basic part of gender identity is what I call our transcendent sense of gender. Of course, he doesn't really explain what the transcendent sense of gender is, and it seems to have a rather mystical flavor. And it's hard to believe that this transcendent sense of gender, which no one seemed to be talking about until very recently, is a foundational component of modern medicine. But here we are. So I'll get back to gender identity later. Here's something else from the Times more recently, just a few days ago, actually, last week, November the 26th. And this was the almost inevitable article saying, you could have predicted this some years ago, saying that, look, transgender activists have started to question the movement's confrontational approach, because they certainly have been extremely confrontational in the US and the UK in particular. And this has produced, not surprisingly, a big backlash. It's been extremely unfortunate, I would have said, for transgender people themselves. Facing diminishing public support, some activists say all or nothing tactics are not working. We have to make it okay for someone to change their minds. And then the article began, to get on the wrong side of transgender activists is often to endure their unsparing criticism. And no less a person than J.K. Rowling, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, who has involved herself in the transgender debate in the UK, got rather offended by this, because after all, what's so bad about unsparing criticism, if indeed it is deserved? And she tweeted The rewriting of history begins. Opponents of gender ideology haven't merely endured unsparing criticism. I haven't simply been told that I betrayed real feminism or received a few book-burning videos. Instead, I've been sent thousands of threats of murder, rape, and violence. A trans woman posted my family's home address with a bomb-making guide, and so on. So that's something else I will touch on, trans rights activism. Here's something else from the Times, again, very recent. Can everyone hear me okay if I'm speaking too quickly or anything? Just let me know.
Yes.
So this is about the issue of trans women in sports, how a women's college volleyball team became the center of a transgender athlete debate. So one college volleyball team has a women's volleyball team has a transgender woman on the team, and lots of other teams in the same league have taken great exception to this and have refused to play this team because they have a transgender woman on the team. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of locutions or expressions that appeared in the New York Times article. So the first is assigned female at birth. So far, there's been no foolproof way of ensuring that trans women have no retained advantage over athletes assigned female at birth. That's an expression that I'll have a little bit to say about. Of course, it's athletes assigned female at birth rather than female athletes. And the other phrase is non-transgender women. So trans volleyball players are eligible to play if their testosterone level is less than 10 nanomoles per liter. That's at least 4 times more than what many experts say is the top of the range for non-transgender women and in the typical range for adult men. And that expression strongly gives the impression that, well, there are 2 kinds of women. There are the women with low testosterone levels. Those are the non-transgender women. And then there's this other kind of woman, the transgender woman, who may well have testosterone in the typical male range. Okay, and then something that happened, of course, you've been preoccupied with your own political issues recently, so you may have overlooked this one. But just yesterday, there was a hearing at the Supreme Court over a case about a ban the state of Tennessee has recently enacted on gender-affirming care for minors. So puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are not allowed, according to the state of Tennessee, for minors, for young people, children and adolescents. And this case went all the way up, was appealed and went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they heard oral arguments yesterday. And you can see in this picture like sort of the 2 dueling points of view. So there's this poster here, Supreme Court in the background, let trans kids bloom. So according to one side, it's all about letting a certain kind of child flourish. They wouldn't flourish without medical intervention. So it's extremely cruel to deprive them of medical treatment that allows them to flourish or bloom. And then here we have the opposition. This other poster, stop transing gay kids. So from this point of view, well, really, you know, there aren't any trans kids. There are just these gender non-conforming gay kids who are being gulled into thinking that there's something wrong with their bodies and they need to change them. Okay, so I will also get back to that. So, okay, so that gives us a bunch of topics which I intend to talk about. They might seem rather disparate and disconnected, but they are actually they are actually closely related, and I'll try and explain why. And I'll just change the order of the topics from the order in which I presented them. So let's start off with a little bit about transgender activism, in particular in my own profession of philosophy, and then I'll say something about the word woman and the expression assigned sex, and then something about gender identity, and then something about pediatric gender medicine. Okay, so some of you will have heard of Kathleen Stock, who's French, by the way, is fluent, so I would certainly invite her for a talk if you haven't already. She's a philosopher in the UK who, in 2018, raised a few mild objections. They really were quite mild to the then proposed reform of the UK's 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which would have ushered in a form of gender self-identification. So fire and brimstone rained down upon her for about 3 years, after which she resigned from Sussex University in England in 2021. And she did manage to write an excellent book, Material Girls, which you can see on the screen, in the interim, as well as pick up an OBE, an Order of the British Empire, in the 2021 New Year's Honours List. And in the top left, you can see some protesters at her university waving this banner, "Stock out." Anyway, when she got the OBE in 2021, that prompted an open letter from many of her professional colleagues in philosophy and elsewhere in academia, denouncing Stock, who incidentally is a politically liberal lesbian, for furthering gender oppression and reinforcing the patriarchy. At least that's what the letter literally said. It's still online, you can read it. And eventually that letter was signed by almost 800 people. Now the number of prominent gender-critical feminist philosophers with positions in academia is hovering around one, namely Holly Lawford-Smith, who's at Melbourne University in Australia, and who seems to be in a sort of perpetual state of cancellation. And because of the, you may or may not have heard of this journal, but it's certainly well worth looking at. It's all open access. Because of the increasing censoriousness in philosophy and elsewhere, in 2021, the philosopher Peter Singer started the Journal of Controversial Ideas with 2 colleagues. And here's, on the left, here's Lawford Smith, and I think it's the latest issue, writing about women-only spaces. This paper appeared in the Journal of Controversial Ideas instead of a mainstream journal of feminist philosophy. Should tell you a lot. And Holly's most recent book is Sex Matters, which you can see on the right. So my own book, as Celine mentioned, was under contract with Oxford University Press and was cancelled by that press. And the same thing happened to Holly. Her book was also under contract with OUP, and both her book and my book were cancelled at around the same time. Now, Holly's book did, in fact, come out with Oxford eventually, unlike mine. But that's because Lawford Smith enlisted the help of an organization in the UK called the Free Speech Union, and they forced Oxford, under the threat of legal action, to backtrack and publish the book. It's quite an extraordinary story, for probably the first time this has ever happened in the history of Oxford University Press, one of the oldest university presses in the world. And I wrote, if you want to read further, I wrote about my adventures down the rabbit hole of sex and gender in this online magazine called Quillette in April of last year. And if you're interested, you can easily find it at Quillette or on my homepage. And if you don't have access to it, you can just email me for a copy. Okay, so that's all I'll say about transgender activism. The situation in philosophy is now no better really than it was a few years ago. It's quite inhospitable to impartial intellectual inquiry into these topics. It's extremely unfortunate, and it's also extremely ironic, since philosophy, you might have thought, would have been the one discipline where you're allowed to raise any question or consider any hypothesis, no matter how outrageous. Indeed, in introductory philosophy classes, we often start off with René Descartes in the Meditations, who ends the first meditation questioning the existence of basically everything. That's viewed as entirely acceptable, but somehow questioning whether trans women are women, for example, is supposed to be off limits, even to professional philosophers. Okay, well, let me say something about the word woman and similar terms. So, Simone de Beauvoir asked the question, what is a woman, in The Second Sex in 1949. And you might have thought, even though those sorts of questions are actually quite difficult to answer, I mean, philosophers have been asking since Plato, what is truth, what is justice, and so on. You might have thought that that question is actually remarkably easy to answer. And in fact, the answer is given in dictionaries, not just the English dictionary, but also French dictionaries and German dictionaries and Swahili dictionaries and so on. A woman is just a mature or adult female of our species, or as the Oxford English Dictionary has it, an adult female human being. And this dictionary definition was kind of famously or notoriously displayed on a billboard by a feminist activist in the UK in 2018, caused a huge fuss. Okay, so you might think, okay, perhaps putting this on a billboard is in extremely poor taste, but at least the basic idea that, the basic claim that to be a woman is to be an adult human female, and to be a man is to be an adult human male, and to be a boy is to be a juvenile human male, and similarly for being a girl, at least that it should be pretty uncontroversial. Perhaps we shouldn't paste it on the side of buildings, but at least it's pretty obvious. Now, what's very interesting is that in philosophy, in feminist philosophy, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with these sorts of questions, they tend to disagree, and almost universally, they think that this account of what it is to be a woman is just wrong. Now, the French have to take some blame for this, because a lot of this is inspired by that famous remark at the beginning of volume 2 of Beauvoir's The Second Sex: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And many feminist thinkers have taken that to mean that there's something social about being a woman. To be a woman is to be socialized in a certain way. So in that respect, being a woman is like being a queen, or being a midwife, or being an actress. You can only be a queen or a midwife or an actress if you're embedded in a society of some kind. Whereas adult human females can be found living alone, at least in principle, living alone on desert islands without a society in sight. And if you look at the authoritative Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and in particular the entry Feminist Perspectives on Sex and Gender, this is how it ends. Gender metaphysics, or what it is to be a woman or a man, or a genderqueer person, set that aside, is still very much a live issue. And although contemporary feminist philosophical debates have questioned some of the tenets and details of the original 1960s sex-gender distinction, most still hold on to the view that gender is about social factors and that it is in some sense distinct from biological sex. So that is the author's way of putting the claim that most philosophers, or most feminist philosophers, still hold on to the view that to be a woman is in part to inhabit some kind of social role, or in part to be socialized in a certain way. To be a woman, in other words, is not to be an adult female of our species. There's something distinctively social about being a woman. Now, I think that view is clearly wrong, and you can argue quite convincingly for the dictionary view of the matter. But I have to admit, I'm very much in a minority on that point. I mean, it's another thing that's interesting is that even though philosophers who've considered the question, what is it to be a woman, have almost invariably come up with the answer, well, whatever it is, it's not to be an adult human female. You really would have thought that these philosophers would have intervened in public debates about what it is to be a woman. After all, there's a conservative commentator called Matt Walsh in the United States who made a very popular documentary film in, I think, 2022 called What is a Woman? I don't think he realized that his question was taken from Beauvoir's The Second Sex. But at the end of that documentary, Matt Walsh goes around asking academics and other experts what is a woman, and receives various sort of hilarious, incomprehensible answers. And at the end of the movie, Matt Walsh's wife gives the adult human female answer. And this is presented as if this is just blindingly obvious, and all these theoreticians have no idea what they're talking about. You would have thought then that the experts in philosophy would have taken to the public airways and newspapers and so on and explained just why they think that women are not in fact adult human females. Interestingly, they have not done that. Okay, so now let me say something quite briefly about assigned sex. So I did write something with biologist Carol Hooven in the New York Times this year about this locution, sex assigned at birth, which is now extremely popular. It's not just popular in journalism. I assume you have an equivalent in French, but it's not just popular in newspapers, but also in medical and scientific journals. And of course, the main problem with saying sex assigned at birth is it invites the inference that because you're using this convoluted phrase, sex assigned at birth, as opposed to just sex, then there's something suspicious about sex. Maybe we can't really be sure that baby is a male or female at birth, or maybe the whole idea of being male or female is not fully comprehensible, and is somehow suspicious or dubious. One thing we can be sure of is what sex label babies are given at birth. We can't be sure, or maybe it doesn't really fundamentally doesn't make any sense to say that some child is just plainly female. Instead, we should just retreat to safer ground and say that instead the child was just assigned female at birth. It would be overreaching, sticking our neck out too far to say that the child is just female. That's the impression that this locution sort of gives, and it's no accident that that's the impression that it gives. And of course, that impression is wrong. There's nothing particularly mysterious about biological sex, about the division, which of course applies not just to humans but to numerous animals and plants, into the two great reproductive categories, male and female. But the problem with saying sex assigned at birth is that you are essentially linguistically disguising this more or less obvious fact. Okay, now gender identity. And then I will explain, after I've done that, I'll then explain how woman and assigned sex and gender identity are all sort of connected in a way that drives a lot of the sort of rhetoric behind contemporary pediatric gender medicine. So gender identity began in 1964. It was used occasionally a few years earlier, but it was first clearly defined in 1964 by two psychiatrists at the University of California in Los Angeles, Robert Stoller, who I'm sure is well known to many of you, who wrote a famous book called Sex and Gender in 1968, I think, and his colleague Ralph Greenson. Ralph Greenson is the one pictured. Here are their two papers. The Stoller one is a contribution to the study of gender identity, and the Greenson one is called On Homosexuality and Gender Identity. Both of their definitions of gender identity are similar, but let's look at Greenson's. Gender identity refers to one's sense of being a member of a particular sex. So in the Stoller-Greenson usage, to talk about someone's gender identity is simply to talk about their conviction that they're male, or alternatively their conviction that they're female. Okay, that was actually a quite useful innovation to have a label for this obvious, very widespread phenomenon. Almost everyone is convinced that they're a member of one sex or another. There's nothing wrong at all with the Stoller-Greenson definition of gender identity. There's nothing particularly mysterious about it. In fact, it was very fruitful. It in effect produced a flourishing research program in developmental psychology, where you investigate just how and when children develop a gender identity in this sense. When do boys come to realize that they're male, and when do girls come to realize that they're female, and what other views do they have about what it is to be male or female? But from those innocuous beginnings, gender identity is now everywhere, in at least in the Anglosphere, in popular culture, the law, education, and healthcare. So on the left is a snippet from Wikipedia about the US Equality Act, which is now stalled in the US Senate, and given the new Trump administration, I assume it's just not going anywhere. But anyway, the act proposes to replace the word sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act with the phrase sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity. And gender identity figures in all sorts of state laws. Many laws in my home state of Massachusetts explicitly mention gender identity. And on the right is the Gender Identity Workbook for Kids, 2018, one of many such books. Okay, so gender identity is now everywhere. But the interesting thing is that it actually isn't gender identity as understood by Stoller and Greenson. So if you look at the latest edition of W. Path's Standards of Care for the health of transgender and gender diverse people, gender identity is defined as follows. Gender identity refers to a person's deeply felt internal intrinsic sense of their own gender. And whatever gender means here, it really isn't clear at all. But one thing that is clear is that it doesn't mean sex. It doesn't mean biological sex. So in addition to supplementing the Stoller-Greenson definition with deeply felt internal and intrinsic, sex is swapped out for gender. One thing that the new conception of gender identity does retain, though, is from the Stoller and Greenson conception, is that everyone has a gender identity. In the Stoller and Greenson sense, that's true simply because everyone is, with some tiny exceptions, everyone is convinced that they belong to one sex or another. And that's true in the new sense of gender identity as well. Is an authoritative textbook, one of the editors of which is Jack Turban, the free-to-be author I mentioned at the start. In that textbook, it says, each of us has a gender identity, though many of us never give it much thought. No citations or evidence are provided for this claim. And another distinctive feature of the new conception of gender identity is that whatever gender is, this is what the Gender Identity Workbook for Kids says, the absolute best person to know your gender is you. You are the expert on your own gender. So, of course, that to some extent that's true in the case of Stoller and Greenson's definition, but it definitely has limits. So some children really are in error about their sex. It happens very rarely, but it does happen. A boy might mistakenly think that he's a member of the female sex, for example. Of course, when children are born, they have a sex, but don't have any views, right or wrong, about what sex they are. So you are not the absolute best person to know and declare your sex, especially if you're very young. Sometimes other people are in a much better position. However, the new kind of gender identity departs from the old kind in just that respect. And here's a more reserved statement of the same idea from a 2018 paper by Jason Rafferty et al., which is really the position statement for the American Association of Pediatrics on gender-affirming care, ensuring comprehensive care and support for transgender and gender-diverse children and adolescents. In that paper, they claim research substantiates that children who are pre-pubertal and assert an identity of TGD, that is, transgender and gender-diverse, know their gender as clearly and as consistently as their developmentally equivalent peers who identify as cisgender. Okay, so on the one hand, gender replaces sex in the definition of gender identity. It's not clear what gender means, but whatever it does mean, everyone is supposed to have some special access to their own gender. And here's another element which is new, which isn't a feature of the old original Stoller-Greenson kind of gender identity. A discrepancy between your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth and associated physical characteristics can cause gender dysphoria. In fact, it is the cause of gender dysphoria, at least according to WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So here's something from their Standards of Care 7. Gender dysphoria is distress that is caused by a discrepancy between a person's gender identity and that person's sex assigned at birth and associated gender role or primary and secondary sex characteristics. So now gender identity figures into some causal theory of the origin of gender dysphoria. Okay, so now let me explain, before getting on to something about gender affirming care, and then I will wrap up. Let me just explain how these topics are all related: gender identity, the definition of woman, and sex assigned at birth. So one thing that we do know about gender is that girl and woman are genders. There are typically supposed to be many more, but at least girl and woman are genders. Okay, so we've been told that gender identity is an infallible or more or less infallible sense of one's own gender, and examples are girl and woman. We've also been told that everyone has a gender identity. Okay, now it actually follows from these two premises that women aren't adult human females and girls aren't juvenile human females. Why does that follow? Well, some people who are not adult human females claim to be women. Or say, my gender identity is woman. According to the first premise, they must be right. They are women. If a natal male who's 10 years old, say, says, I am a girl, according to the first premise, he must be right. But of course, he isn't a juvenile human female. He's a juvenile human male. So we have a counterexample to the claim that girls are juvenile human females, because here we have a juvenile human male who's a girl. So that's why this apparently obvious claim that women are adult human females has to be rejected if you buy the standard view about gender identity, that it's an infallible sense of your own gender, and that everyone, it's not just this hypothetical thing that people may or may not, that maybe hardly anyone has. In fact, everyone has it. If you buy those two things, then women can't be adult human females. Okay, so suppose we accept that. Well, then it's the role of sex is now becomes very puzzling. I mean, you might say, yeah, but look, something has gone wrong. Surely women are female. Could there really be male women? After all, Simone de Beauvoir's book was called The Second Sex, and that was all about women, or is it really all about women and girls? Did she make some terrible error calling her book The Second Sex, because part of her some of the people who are women and girls are actually male and not female? And then even if you bought the idea that, yeah, that some women are male, still you might think, well, the male-female distinction is obviously very important. It can't be ignored. There's this very important division which maybe cross-cuts the division between boys and men on the one hand and girls and women on the other, namely the male-female division. Shouldn't we talk about that and emphasize that? And maybe that's in many contexts, maybe that's much more important than this distinction between boys and men and girls and women. Okay, so clearly this is a bit of an embarrassment if you've bought the earlier stuff. And the activist solution to this conundrum is to adopt this phrasing, sex assigned at birth. You can't disappear sex entirely. You can't just stop talking about it. They have sort of implicitly realized that you have to make some kind of reference to males and females. And the very clever solution that they came up with is essentially to say, look, there's something deeply rotten at the very idea, something deeply rotten with the very idea of biological sex. You can find clinicians like Jack Turban saying this explicitly. He says this in his book. We really just shouldn't call people biological males and biological females. It's just not clear what we're saying. Maybe there's nothing in reality corresponding to this linguistic distinction between males and females. So instead, we should adopt this much more precise, secure locution of sex assigned at birth. So that's how, as I see it, woman and gender identity and sex assigned at birth are connected. And now there's a further connection between all this and my last topic, which is gender affirming care. And that's the idea that gender dysphoria is caused by a discrepancy or incongruence between a person's infallibly known gender and the physical characteristics associated with their sex assigned at birth. Okay, so once you bought that idea, what should the treatment for gender dysphoria be? Well, you can't change someone's gender. So the only treatment for gender dysphoria is to change the physical characteristics. So in other words, you get gender affirming care. The current orthodox kind of pediatric gender medicine, at least as practiced in the US. So let me now just say a little bit about gender affirming care, which, as I suspect, is the topic that you're most interested in. So here's Diane Ehrensaft, who works at UC San Francisco with Jack Turban, and who's a very prominent proponent of gender affirming care. And she says that that's a method of therapeutic care that allows children to speak for themselves about their self-experienced gender identity and to evolve into their authentic gender selves, no matter at what age. Gender-affirming medical interventions are a crucial part of this procedure: puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. And so, sometimes the claims people make for the benefits of this gender-affirming model are really quite astounding. So we have someone in the US called Rachel Levine, who's the Assistant Secretary for Health in the Department of Health and Human Services. So she's a high-ranking government official, very influential. And in 2022, she said, gender-affirming care is medical care, mental health care. It is suicide prevention care. It saves lives. And then there's some complimentary thing about WPATH. WPATH assesses the full state of the science and provides substantive, rigorously analyzed, peer-reviewed recommendations to the medical community. It's founded, gender-affirming care, on a vast body of medical literature. And then, of course, it turned out later, this is an article from this year from The Economist, that WPATH has been cooking the books and manipulating research into trans medicine so they get the result that they want. and that inconvenient findings, for example, that the evidence base for the efficacy of these procedures is very weak, has been suppressed. So they, in particular, they interfered with the production of systematic reviews that they'd commissioned from something called the Evidence-Based Practice Center at Johns Hopkins University in 2018. And so there was that, and then in the UK, there was, of course, the release of the final report of Hilary Cass's review of gender identity services for children and young people. Cass is the very distinguished pediatrician. She's the former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. And that was largely, the Cass review, incidentally, was largely ignored in the US, although it was mentioned by some of the Supreme Court justices in the hearing. I mentioned the one that about the Tennessee ban on gender affirming procedures for young people that I mentioned and that occurred yesterday. And here's something from the British Medical Journal just after the commenting on the Cass review. This is from the editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal. Studies in gender medicine fall woefully short in terms of methodological rigor. But of course, if you've accepted these claims about gender identity, that people, even very young people, have an infallible sense of their own gender, whatever that is exactly, and that this discrepancy between someone's gender and their sex assigned at birth causes gender dysphoria, it can be very hard to see these objections clearly. So here's something that came out of the Yale School of Medicine critiquing the Cass review by Meredith McNamara et al. Oh, and also the authors included the aforementioned Jack Turban. So they say, denying the existence of transgender people of any age, specifically trans children, is an invalid professional viewpoint. The Cass review does not consider the most likely explanation for why most youth who receive early supportive interventions continue on to gender-affirming hormone therapy. Namely, the explanation is that they are indeed transgender. And of course, that really only makes sense if you buy these modern doctrines about gender identity. If you don't, then it's very hard to see just what could be meant by saying that a child is either cisgender or transgender. Of course, there are some children who suffer debilitating gender dysphoria, and they may indeed be helped by transitioning. But beyond that, it's hard to understand what could be meant by saying that the child is in fact transgender as opposed to cisgender. That isn't some medical diagnosis. And just a few more slides. I'm sure people know the story already. Puberty blockers started in the Netherlands in the 90s. Well, the first patient was a dysphoric female who was given puberty blockers around 1987, I think, when she was 13. And that lasted for 5 years, and testosterone and multiple surgeries followed, and it seemed to be a big success. That was the origin of the Dutch protocol, which was actually quite rigorous as far as, at least on paper, as far as the constraints it placed on patients eligible for treatment. When the Dutch protocol was imported to the United States in the early 2000s, those guardrails were lifted. I mean, I should point out, not surprisingly, that this early patient was on the one hand, a classical tomboy, and had issues with her father. His Mediterranean background made acceptance of his daughter's masculinity very difficult. And just to go back to the protest outside the Supreme Court and that sign saying, you know, stop trans and gay kids, it is, of course, true that, at least if we're talking about early onset gender dysphoria, that homosexuality plays sort of an enormous role, being very highly correlated with gender non-conformity. So in one of the early Dutch studies, this is from the 2011 paper, basically all, I think there are two exceptions on the slide, but I think if you like dig into it further, the two exceptions become just one. In any event, out of 70 participants, the overwhelming majority were non-heterosexual, which is really quite staggering when you consider the base rate of same-sex attraction, which is, of course, very low. And this connection was brought out in Hannah Barnes' excellent book, Time to Think, about the collapse of the UK's gender identity service a few years ago. It was closed down. So one clinician recalls families who remarked, "Thank God my child is trans and not gay or lesbian." And then there was even a dark joke in the JIDS team that there would be no people, that there would be no gay people left at the rate JIDS was going. And of course, you know this already. This is from the Cass Review. Across many countries, child and adolescent referrals for gender dysphoria increased very rapidly from 2014 on, and now the dominant presentation is essentially adolescent females with rapid onset gender dysphoria. And you may remember that the Brown University researcher who coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, Lisa Littman, received enormous blowback for writing a paper about this phenomenon. And of course, there are big societal shifts as far as transgender identification goes. We have this confusing terminology in America, labeling different generations. There are boomers and Generation X people and millennials. I think the millennials are people in their early 30s and 40s. And then we have Generation Z, and these are teenagers and people in their early 20s. And of course, there's a massive spike in transgender identification among that generation compared with earlier generations, particularly among females, and the same is true for non-binary identifications as well. So big social changes. Whether this trend will continue or not, I really have no idea. Okay, so then finally, just to end, so in the UK, the topic of gender-affirming care, it's a very controversial issue, as it is everywhere, but it is by no means as politically partisan as it is in the United States. So very unfortunately, in the United States, there's a very strong correlation between whether you're between being a Democrat and being pro-gender affirming care, or being a Republican and being against gender affirming care. So the left-right political division lines up almost perfectly with the pro-anti gender affirming care axis. There's absolutely no reason why that should be so, and it isn't so in in the UK. So the left-wing current Labour government is on board with continuing the ban that imposed by the previous Conservative government on puberty blockers. So there's a lot of consensus there across the left-right political division. And in the United States, it seems extremely likely that the Supreme Court will uphold the Tennessee law on transgender care. So this is not to say that this is going to help with polarization at all. What we're going to end up with is probably about half of the 50 states having bans of one sort or another on transgender care, and the other 50 states not having bans, and indeed throwing their doors open to any refugees from the other states who want to come in and get transgender care, even for very young people. So the political temperature in the UK surrounding this, the trans issue, may very well be on the decline. I don't see any signs at the moment that it's really on the decline in the US. As to France, well, you'll have to tell me. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. On va enlever le comment ça s'appelle, l'écran partagé. Yes, ok. Jean, est-ce que tu souhaiterais intervenir?
Oui, je vais tout de suite poser une question. Alex, I'll be asking you a question and I'll paraphrase it in French as well. So,
oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay. Oui, je vais lui poser une question sur justement la question du langage et des termes qui sont utilisés et en quoi la théorie du genre repose en partie sur des artifices rhétoriques. In what way do you think, Alex, that a large part of the gender theory is based on rhetorical twists of language, like circular definitions, replacing sex with gender, or saying that a woman, nobody knows what a woman is, or defining.
Yes.
I mean, a woman is whoever feels like a woman, and you never have a positive a definition of anything, which is quite strange in a field that is supposed to be theoretical, and that, I mean, it defies philosophy and logic and linguistics and basic common sense and in the world of science and medicine, that no one should be able to give any objective, factual, and positive definition of those terms.
Yeah, right. That's an excellent question. I mean, a couple of points. So maybe this doesn't quite exhaust the examples, but I think there are sort of two main categories of linguistic innovation to sort of question. So one is when people say people make claims that are, I think at the very least, extremely questionable. For example, that transgender women are women, or transgender girls are girls. So there they seem to be making some sort of factual claim, which would have been extremely controversial a decade or a couple of decades ago, but now seem to be accepted by many experts in this area. You can find plenty of feminist philosophers who think it's just obvious that transgender women are women, and you should just build your your theory of what a woman is around that. So that's one sort of claim. Oh, yeah, okay. So another claim is, you know, everyone has a gender identity. That seems to be another factual claim, which is somewhat dubious, at least if you understand gender identity in the modern sense. But then another sort of another use of language doesn't really involve saying anything false, but rather the idea is to prevent people from saying the straightforward true thing. So for example, sometimes people don't want to speak of women at all, but instead use phrases like cervix havers or menstruators. Sex assigned at birth is another good example. I think it is actually literally true, at least in one sense of assigned, that sex really is assigned at birth. It just means, you know, the sex that someone is classified as at birth. So it's not false to say that I was assigned male at birth. So the issue here isn't truth or falsity, rather it's whether you should be using language in this way, thus preventing people from saying the straightforward true thing, namely that I'm simply male and I was male at birth. So there are those that so you can push back in two directions. On the one hand, you can say, no, what you're saying is false. It's not strictly speaking true that transgender women are women. Or on the other hand, you can say, you can push back in another direction and say, look, it's perfectly true that people have cervixes and that people menstruate, but we shouldn't be using these expressions in place of the perfectly good word women, which will serve the purpose just as well, if not better, than these new ways of speaking. Sorry, that doesn't, I mean, you just opened up a huge can of worms with this excellent question, and I could probably go on at interminable length on to try and answer
Because
various facets of it, but maybe that will.
That is a recurring element of your demonstration. Is you've mentioned phrasing, disguising the obvious, and all. I mean, one is constantly trying to make sense of the phrasing itself, as if I mean, you mentioned gender and you added whatever that is exactly, because after all, sex assigned at birth, you could just as well say gender assigned at birth, but it always depends on what you mean by that. And it's as if nobody was really clear about that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, maybe there's a right. Yeah, very good. I mean, there's a third people do actually talk about gender assigned at birth. The problem with this slippery word gender, I mean, I have to like apologize on behalf of the English, because we have really like foisted it upon the French. And, you know, you have to use genre, no doubt it sounds a little odd. And certainly Simone de Beauvoir, who's sometimes supposed to have come up with this distinction between sex and gender, certainly didn't use those words in the second sex. And just to add to the confusion, in English, one perfectly good sense of the word gender is just as a synonym for sex. So that makes it often very hard to understand what people mean when they talk about gender. You know, often it could just be totally innocuous because they're just talking about sex, or it could be far from innocuous because they're talking about something else. Yeah, so I should really have added a third category to these sort of linguistic issues or linguistic problems. So one is people saying things that are just not true, or at least are highly questionable. Another is using phrases like sex assigned at birth or people who menstruate or something to avoid stating the obvious. And then a third category is using words whose meaning is just very unclear. And gender is, I think, a prime example of that. It's very obscure from a lot of the in a lot of the literature, just what the word gender is supposed to mean. It's like bearing a huge amount of weight in the argument, but it's never clearly explained.
And precisely, the fact that gender is so subjective that you have a sort of intuition of what gender is, but you never know exactly what gender is as a concept. And you mentioned that at the beginning. It feels like a very metaphysical concept, and yet it is used for medical exploration. How can you base medical intervention on that sort of metaphysical intuition? And how does gender theory reconcile that with the idea that gender is also something fluid that can change, and that you don't have just two genders, but dozens of them?
Yes, well, right, exactly. Well, that's another problem. The existence of gender fluid people and exactly how that fits with. I mean, I think at the end of the day, these various claims don't really hang together in a coherent fashion. So you have to ignore some and concentrate on others if you're not to just get completely confused. But yes, it is like an awkward fact that there do seem to be these gender fluid people, but then how does that fit exactly with the sort of orthodox view? You can find the psychologist Diane Ehrensaft saying this, that gender identity is this fixed, innate, immutable trait. But how can that be if some people just change their gender identity over the course of a lifetime? In any event, I think you're absolutely right that this is not part of the problem with the gender affirming model is that it's sort of bound up with this very confused theory about what's going on, and this very confusing use of language.
Céline, tu voulais intervenir?
Non, je me demandais s'il y avait une influence, parce qu'il parle pas mal du deuxième sexe. Est-ce qu'il y aurait une influence de Beauvoir? C'est 1949, je sais pas quand il a été traduit en anglais, mais est-ce qu'on aurait une influence sur la destinée de l'identité de genre, gender identity, à partir de Beauvoir ou pas? Je sais pas, hein, je pose naïvement.
Do you think Simone de Beauvoir's book was really influential in American gender theory? Was the basis for that?
I think it was. I think it was. So the American philosopher or gender studies theorist Judith Butler, who's been very influential, wrote an early paper about Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and in particular about that remark that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. And yeah, she interpreted that to mean that, I mean, she didn't put it this way exactly, but she interpreted it to mean that, you know, being a woman was not just a matter of being female or being human or being adult, but of something else. And I think the irony is, I mean, it does, in a way, it doesn't really matter what Beauvoir herself thought, but the irony is that I think it's very unlikely that Beauvoir herself actually agreed with this interpretation of her remark. I think all she meant was that women and girls are just heavily socialized, and because of that, we're apt to think that certain feminine characteristics are natural and inevitable, whereas in fact they're artificial and changeable. She certainly didn't mean to deny that women are adult human females. I mean, she said in the book I give a number of quotes from Beauvoir, from interviews and whatever. She said things like, you know, in answer to the question, what is a woman? She said something like, a woman is a human being with a certain physiology.
Mhm.
I mean, that's not the view of someone who thinks that to be a woman is to occupy a certain social role.
Mm.
But Beauvoir says, to give us maybe straightforward answer to your question, I think certainly via Butler, Beauvoir has been very, very influential.
Also, the very last lines of your book, I mean, you say, underneath the surely transient contemporary social currents discussed in this book is the human condition. And it is quite striking that gender activism does not view itself as a social construct that could be transient. Is it something that that they never quite address? I mean, it's like they have an absolute truth for the first time in the history of mankind, and that
Yes,
truth
that's
is
right.
not a social construct.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, of course, to some extent they try and address this by saying, well, you know, transgender people have always existed and so on.
Mm.
And which is, like, in one sense true. I mean, it's certainly true that in many societies you can find, you know, let's say males who live as females, or who maybe live as, in the case of the Samoan Fa'afafine, as some third sort of intermediate gender. I mean, in traditional societies, this is normally a device for coping with feminine homosexual males, where society is dealing with those. But of course, so that's the kind of truth in that claim. But what isn't true is that transsexuality in the form that, you know, we're familiar with it these days has always been with us. That's a very recent phenomenon where people try to transition medically to live as the other sex, and claim that they are the other sex and so on. That's really quite new. So I mean, I suppose there are like two things that have been more or less constant throughout human society. So one is that people always come up with theories of gender, in the sense that people will try and give explanations of the differences between men and women. What is a man exactly? What is a woman? Why are the two different? So, you know, Aristotle thought that females were sort of underbaked males. If you cook the fetus at a lower temperature, then you get a female. If not, if it's hotter, then you get a male. He also thought that by nature men should rule over women. And Simone de Beauvoir was a kind of gender blank slate theorist, I think. I think she thought that all or almost all psychological and behavioral differences between the sexes could be erased by making appropriate adjustments to society. So throughout history, from Aristotle to Beauvoir, people have theorized about the sexes and the differences between men and women. And I think, so that's one constant, and that's, I think, explained by the other constant, which is that humans now and in the past come in two sexed forms. And this is extremely important for, like, obvious reasons to any human society. I mean, all, you know, pre-modern human societies had very sharp sexual divisions of labor, and of course you need to recognize that difference in order for reproduction. And I think that, just as a matter of fact, the Beauvoirian kind of blank slatism is wrong, and there are significant psychological and behavioral differences between the sexes that aren't explained by socialization. And indeed, I think that is actually part of the explanation of why people throughout history, it doesn't matter what society you go to, they're always obsessed in one way, in one way or the other, between this division between the sexes.
Yeah, as you said, people have always theorized about that, but how come, I mean, a striking fact now is that gender theory is no longer a theory. It expresses itself as activism, and is even now squarely in the business of censorship, of slander, and even acts of violence. How do you account for that shift from theory, even metaphysical theory, and now social violence?
Yeah, that is, I'm really not sure why, about why that is. That is an excellent question. I mean, it's true that there is a lot of violence-laced rhetoric. I mean, I gave that quote from J.K. Rowling earlier about the thousands of death threats that she's received, and there is the other regrettable strand as well, namely the censorship and repression of disfavored views. And yeah, it is an excellent question, just why the debate has become so heated and why people have taken such extreme measures to further the cause of their own side. I mean, I have to say that, you know, sometimes the rhetoric on the other side has been hyperbolic. You know, the trans rights movement is some like vicious misogynistic men's rights movement or whatever. But then on the other hand, I mean, obviously death threats are unpleasant, but you have to have a sense of proportion, and that a lot of it really is just rhetoric. And as far as I know, no one has actually died. You know, 100,000 Russian soldiers or whatever have died in the war with Ukraine, and God knows how many, presumably fewer Ukrainian soldiers, but like massive casualties. The gender wars are pretty bad, but as far as I know, the body count is nothing like that.
But on the other hand, the gender debate has become something that has, I mean, it's almost a political dividing line across the Western world, and
that is right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can see this in, well, so first, it is definitely lines up with a political dividing line in the US, as I said, less so, fortunately, in the UK. But often the activists themselves want to sort of enforce this division between people who agree with them, who are in every other respect good and have appropriate opinions, and people who disagree with them, who in every other respect are bad and have terrible opinions. So you can see this in Judith Butler's recent book, Who's Afraid of Gender? So she classes everyone who's allegedly afraid of gender and who's like against Judith Butler and gender affirming care and whatever, including like Hungary's Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin or the Pope or J.K. Rowling. She classes all of them together. They're all basically on the same side. And I think that's just like an extremely unconvincing rhetorical move. I mean, there's nothing interesting in common between J.K. Rowling and the Pope and Vladimir Putin. but it's just another a kind of guilt by association move where you try and, you know, disparage your opponent by saying, look, you know, you and Hitler agree on this one issue, therefore you're just as bad as Hitler. I don't think there's any if you just take the issue of gender affirming care, I don't think that has any particular political valence to it. I mean, of course, there are plenty of card-carrying left-wingers who have their doubts about gender affirming care, and you can find like some very socially conservative people who thoroughly approve it, precisely because they're extremely relieved that, you know, that they don't have a gay kid after all, but rather a trans one.
Early in your presentation, you mentioned Greenson's definition that you had the sense of being a member of a sex, and that's a subjective view, and it's as if subjectivity had become a ground for defining reality, and that it is the basis of the whole gender identity thing, and that you can no longer define reality objectively, but you have to use that sense of being something, which has, I mean, how do you tell the difference between hallucinations, schizophrenia, if subjectivity is everything?
Right. I mean, just although Stoller and Greenson were perfectly clear that your gender identity is one thing, your conviction of belonging to one sex or another is one thing, and whether you do in fact belong to one sex or another is quite another matter. You can get things wrong. It doesn't happen very often because it's typically your sex is so obvious. But obviously in certain special cases, you can actually be wrong about what sex you belong to. But as you were saying, there's in a way, the distinction between the subjective and the objective, or appearance and reality, is compressed or eliminated in the modern conception of gender identity, because here the appearance is the reality. If I have a sense of myself as belonging to a particular gender, then I just do belong to that gender. There's no wedge that can be inserted between between how things appear to me and how things actually are. The two just coincide. Whereas in every other case, of course, they come apart. You know, I can believe that it's raining even though it's sunny.
Céline, tu avais...
Peut-être quelqu'un a une question, mais j'en poserai une après par rapport à l'identité de genre. Est-ce que quelqu'un a une question? Oui, Beryl.
How do you understand that there's such a huge deny of the Cass report? You said like there's a deny in the United States concerning what's inside of the Cass report, and my concern is how can we explain that there's such a deny, of course, concerning evidence systematic reviews worldwide?
Yeah, I think part of it is probably explained by American arrogance, especially when it comes to healthcare. You know, even though American life expectancy is not so great compared to the UK and Europe and other industrialized nations, we think we have the best healthcare system in the world, and all the medical experts are over in the US. So that makes it a lot easier to dismiss the Cass review, since it didn't originate in the US. But then I mean, I was surprised by the lack of coverage the Cass review received in the mainstream American press. I would have expected it has been covered to some extent by the New York Times, but certainly not extensively. One thing that was interesting about the Supreme Court hearing yesterday over the Tennessee ban was that one of the justices had clearly read the Cass Review, or at any rate was familiar with it, and asked a question which was about the Cass Review, and it was actually about suicide. And I can't remember who the justice was now, but there was an attorney called Chase Strangio, who's a trans man, as a sort of activist attorney, arguing for the American Civil Liberties Union, which has taken the side of taken the gender affirming side in this lawsuit. And the Supreme Court Justice got Strangio to admit via the Cass Review that there was no evidence that gender affirming care prevents suicide. Yeah, so I don't know if I have a completely satisfactory answer to that question, but also, you know, these things are very hard to change. The whole American medical the whole American medical establishment, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and so on, has just they put their collective weight behind the gender affirming model. So if you have some slight inclination to defer to these supposedly expert bodies, it's like easy enough to brush off the Cass Review as some outlier.
Ouais, peut-être, je le dis en français parce que on pourrait dire, et ça, Jean, on peut réfléchir ensemble aussi, c'est vrai que la langue, en fait, à quel point le glissement de genre à identité de genre, je sais pas si euh, c'est finalement c'est devenu identité de genre un levier qui rend possible finalement le passage à l'acte sur le corps, en fait. C'est plus identité de genre que genre, tu vois. En tout cas,
Lui suggérer. Céline is saying that gender is one thing, but gender identity is yet another concept, and maybe that's where there's a shift enabling the idea that you can intervene on the body because you have an identity. It's not just defining gender socially or intellectually, it becomes something that you are. And maybe
Yes,
that
that's exactly right.
enables
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you need the gender identity bit. I mean, look, you know, you might think you could have the following view. You could think gender dysphoria is caused by a discrepancy between someone's gender and their sexed body. But the person themselves is in no privileged position to find out what their gender is. You could sort of have that view. If you had that view, then you wouldn't be deferring to the patient in the way characteristic of gender affirming care. It's the gender identity bit adds in the idea that the person themselves has some kind of privileged or special access to their own gender. So that's why you get this kind of emphasis on self-diagnosis. It's almost like being in pain. So if you go to your doctor with a headache, the doctor or if you go to your doctor and you say you have a headache, it is most unlikely that the doctor, I suppose it sometimes happens that people are malingering or deceiving the doctor, but it's most unlikely that the doctor would say, well, I'm not really sure that you actually have a headache. Maybe you're wrong about whether you have a headache. He would just take that, he or she would just take that at face value and assume that you have a headache. You're the best person to pronounce on whether you have a headache or not. And that's often not the case for many other properties that we have. People are typically very reliable at pronouncing on what sex they are, but that is something that that they can occasionally get wrong and that other people are better positioned to pronounce about. But if you think of your access to your own gender as something like your access to your own headache, then there's no reason for any doctor to sort of question your self-diagnosis. Yeah, okay, you do have a male gender identity and your body is female, so what do we do? Well, the only thing to do is to change the body.
It's weird how the theory of the mind that is behind that is that you take intuition not just to be valid, but to be sort of sacred, and it's very often presented as something of a revelation. It's often a very religious way of describing that revelation of your inner self, which is, and it's strange again that it should be taken at face value for medical practice.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, there is, people talk about your gender journey and so on. It is conceptualized as very much a revelatory voyage of self-discovery.
Il y avait une question.
It also has, sorry to interrupt, but just to go back to Descartes, I guess all this is the fault of the French, really, Beauvoir and Descartes. Of course, as people point out, it does have a very dualistic flavor to it. So instead of the sort of disembodied Cartesian mind, unextended mind, and the extended body, which are somehow related, we have the sexed body on the one hand and someone's immaterial gender on the other. It very much does have a sort of Cartesian dualist flavor to it.
On va peut-être...
Question de Monsieur Bensman.
Albert?
Qui n'a pas mis son micro.
Oh, Albert, on t'entend pas. Il faut que tu réactives le... C'est moi qui ai fermé les micros.
Ah d'accord. Vous m'entendez là?
C'est bon.
Oui. Donc, je suis ni psychologue ni philosophe, je suis professeur de pédiatrie et vraiment un somaticien pur et dur. Et en fait, quand je vois sex assigned at birth, mais je me pince. Un nouveau-né qui naît avec des testicules, une verge et qui est XY, c'est aussi évident que c'est un garçon que d'affirmer que la Terre, elle est ronde, enfin, et qu'il y ait des discussions là-dessus, j'avoue que je ne comprends pas du tout. Alors maintenant, je voudrais poser la question à un Américain. Si un enfant qui est American African, il est tout noir, et que lui il dit « moi je me sens blanc et que je suis comme un Norvégien », il va dans la vie sociale être considéré comme un blanc, alors c'est ça?
Mr. Bensman is a pediatrician, and
yes.
it's facts are facts. And if and it takes the example of an African American claiming to be a Norwegian and claiming to be white, how would that work for him as in terms of appearance within society?
Yes, right. That's a very good question. I mean, you may or may not have heard of someone called Rachel Dolezal, who was an American, who is an American woman, who, this is back in, I think, 2015, who identified as African American. She had somewhat dark skin. She went to a historically black college. She actually had black adopted siblings and so on. She also worked for some African-American civil rights organization in Washington State. And then it was discovered that her parents were unmistakably white. So it's exactly like your Norwegian example. And then in what was interesting was that everyone said, well, you know, she's an imposter. She's not, even though I think she's sincerely identified as African American, she's actually not African American. But that isn't what happens in the transgender case. You're not supposed to say, well, yeah, we have someone who identifies as a woman, but really isn't a woman. So yeah, that is an excellent analogy. There was, maybe I should mention, not everyone will know about this, but a junior philosopher called Rebecca Tuval wrote a philosophy paper called In Defense of Transracialism in 2017. You can easily look this up on Wikipedia, where she said, in effect, that people like Rachel Dolezal should be treated, you know, with the respect that we accord to transgender people. So there's no need to like shame or mock them or anything like that. We should treat Rachel Dolezal as African American if that's how she wants to be treated. Something like that. Anyway, it was all extremely progressive and tolerant. But she was vilified by her progressive colleagues in feminist philosophy, and there were calls for her paper to be retracted, and she received a huge amount of abuse online and so on. Yeah, so that's another case. It has been pointed out that there's this strange asymmetry between the gender case and the race case.
Bon, bah, je pense que l'heure est venue de conclure.
Pouvoir conclure.
Voilà.
Merci. Thank
you very much, Alex.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Jean, pour tes passionnantes réflexions et questions. Voilà, merci à tout le monde. Et puis, on aura l'occasion d'organiser d'autres interventions, je pense, d'autres débats. Voilà, merci beaucoup et bonne soirée.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye bye. Thank you,
Au
Alex.
revoir.
Bye bye. Au revoir.
Merci, merci.
Merci.